artificial intelligence. The Property Show delivers personalised, laser-focused marketing by combining new media, social media and audience targeting, and gives the agent a digital voice. See how well The Property Show works, and then let's get started telling the world about your property. See it now exclusively at realty.com.au.
Welcome, Bruce Cotterill. Bruce, I mentioned in the open there that we'd be talking, and I mentioned yesterday that we'd be talking about the 3 C words. And when I read the book, it became very obvious to me that the first C word should be clarity, because that's really where the whole message starts. You tell a very powerful story about clarity in your book and relate that to Norman Schwarzkopf. Is it Schwartz? Is that how you pronounce his name? Yeah, Schwarzkopf. Tell me that story. Relay that to us.
Well, I guess the forerunner to the story, Kevin, is I think there's only 2 reasons organisations fail. And the first of those is the obvious one. It's, a lack of appropriate financial management and control, I suppose. But the other one is something that we don't talk about very often. It's a lack of what I call clarity of purpose. In other words, being totally clear on what you're trying to achieve all the time. And 85% of businesses aren't, and that doesn't matter whether you're talking about my surveys or Harvard Business Review or anything in between. Most indicators would suggest that 85% of people in business don't actually have a plan. And here's the worst bit, of the 15% that do, only about a quarter actually tell their people what that plan is. So as I've sort of gone in and out of underperforming companies over the years, one of the most important questions I ask, and I ask it very early on, is that very simple question: what are you trying to achieve? And I heard it illustrated the best by General Norman Schwarzkopf. For those of your listeners who don't recall the name, Schwarzkopf was a 4-star general in the US Army, and he was put in charge of what I call Gulf War I in the early 1990s. And people of my vintage certainly remember Gulf War I. And that was when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And most memorably about that time, it was really the first televised war. And so CNN were traveling along with the US troops in the desert, in Iraq and Kuwait. And we saw pictures coming into our homes live for the very first time. And of course, on the back of that sort of coverage, Schwarzkopf was featured on CNN's NewsHour pretty much every day, irrespective of where you were in the world. And so he became a very, very sort of powerful and well-regarded figure during the 90s. And when he retired from the army, he, as many people do these days, he went on the global speaking circuit. And I managed to see him a couple of times in the early 2000s. And Schwarzkopf was a big man. He was about 6'4". He was probably sort of 17 stone, big, solid-looking fella, intimidating fella, actually. And he just sort of stood in one place in the middle of the stage in front of 3,000 or 4,000 people at a time and gave these absolutely compelling presentations on leadership. And one of the things that struck me about what he did was everything he talked about was so simple. And so he was something of a pretty interesting figure to watch from a leadership point of view. And one particular day I saw him, there were about 3,000 people present, and he gave this presentation on leadership, as I said, which was absolutely first class. And then most unusually for a celebrity-style speaker, he took questions from the audience. So you end up with that situation of people running around the audience with microphones and individuals within the audience standing up and asking a question. And so all the men in the audience, as you might predict, start asking all the obvious guy questions, and there's things like, how many troops did you have, and how many tanks did you have, and how many aircraft carriers did you have in the Gulf, and how many people did you lose, and what did it cost, and why didn't you go all the way to Baghdad and kill Saddam Hussein? All those sort of blokey questions. And I remember on the heels of all of that, one question in particular from a woman, a tiny little woman sitting in the middle of the auditorium, and she stood up and waited for the microphone. And when she got the microphone, she said, "General, how do you run a team of 800,000 people?" Which is a brilliant question. Only a woman would come up with it, Kevin, I think. Us blokes don't think like that. And Schwarzkopf, quick as a flash, said, 800,000 people was easy. You see, we only had one goal. to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And then he went on and said, so if we had any problems, we knew those problems didn't matter unless they affected our ability to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And he said, we had sand problems, health problems, diet problems, color of the vehicle problems, fuel problems. He said, we knew those problems didn't matter unless they affected our ability to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And every time he said that little sentence, it was like he'd said it 1,000 times before. And I realized that he had. Every morning at his morning briefing, he'd told the team that our mission was to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And he said every single person on that 800,000 person team had a little card, like a little business card. And on the card it said, our mission to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And that's what I call clarity of purpose. And when you consider that, and then you say to people, well, tell me about what you're trying to achieve in your business, most organizations don't have that sort of clarity. And the thing about that sort of clarity, when you've got that much clarity in terms of what you're trying to achieve, then your decision making is quite easy. So if you're in the real estate business, you know, the properties you pursue, the location of your office, the type of team you'll put together, all of those things will be dependent on what you're trying to achieve. And yet we see people all the time running businesses or setting up businesses, and they're making those sort of decisions irrespective of that question or that awareness about what their end objectives are. And that's actually why decision making gets difficult. The clearer you are about what you're trying to achieve, the easier your decisions become. So that's what I learned from the Norman Schwarzkopf experience, Kevin.
Yeah, it's wonderful too. And I did say that has to come up front, and for the simple reason that the other two C's are communication, which you touched on, and also consistency, just being so consistent. And there was Stormer Norman every morning telling his troop, or reinforcing and communicating to them what it was. We'll touch on those other two a little bit later, but I wonder in the minute or two that we've got left for today, if you could just step me through, how do you go about defining that clarity of purpose?
Well, I think the first thing is, you know, what's your ultimate long-term goal? Some people running businesses or in the real estate business, they're there because they want to make a lot of money. And it's actually okay to say that. Some people try and shy away from that and say, oh, I'm doing it for the community, or I want to have fun and I enjoy this business. If your goal is to make money, that's okay. But your goal might be also to have a lifestyle or to have some fun. Your target might be to have 1,000 customers. You might be just interested in making a difference in your community. You might have an aspiration to sell your business. You might be driven by the prospects of your people. I've had a couple of roles where it's become clear that, you know, the main goal was to save jobs. You might, you know, so there's a whole lot of reasons as to why you might want to do things. And I think it's very important to understand those, as I said before, because the decisions drive off that. And then once you've got that, you know, what are the key components to achieving that? What product do you need? What positioning do you need? What's your pricing? What's your customer mix? What's your 12-month, 3-month, 1-month objectives? What sort of team do you want to develop? What sort of people do you want to work with? How will those people behave? A lot of those questions that you ask yourself in a typical planning process are going to be driven off that number one question, which is, what am I trying to achieve?
There's a wonderful quote. We'll round this today's episode off with that quote, and it's most unusual, but I think it really goes to the point we've made today. And that was a quote from Alice in Wonderland. It's on, I think, around about page 100 or something like that in your book. And it's the quote is between Alice and the Cheshire Cat. Do you recall what that was?
Yeah, I do. So that's Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and there's a part in the book where Alice, of course, is on the run, and she comes to a fork in the road, and she doesn't know which way to go. And the old Cheshire Cat is standing there, standing on a gate just alongside the road. And she said, I don't know which road to take. And she asks the cat, which way do I go? And the cat says, well, that depends on where you want to go. And she said, well, I don't know where I want to go. And he says, so the old cat says, well, in that case, it doesn't matter which road you take.
I think it sums up beautifully why we need clarity in the business. And you can just hear so many people in the business saying, well, what do I do? What do you want me to do? And if there's no clarity of purpose, then that's exactly what's going to happen. Hey, Bruce, fabulous talking to you again today. Thank you. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll pick up on the other couple of C words. Bruce Cotterill joins us, and the great book, The Best Leaders Don't Shout. We'll put a link to each one of the shows this week so that you can get a copy of that book. But Bruce, thanks for your time. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks, Kevin.
The Daily RE Uncut Show is powered by CoreLogic and supported by Printforce, Rockend and Realty.com.au. Realty.com.au is where you will see all our shows: Real Estate Talk, The Property Show, Auction Update, and of course RE Uncut. We are the home of property.